I always look at trauma as like, it's not what happened, it's what you're left with after, like what's the legacy of that thing. So this speaks to like, well, oh, everyone went through that. I remember the first time I was getting trained in trauma and I learned about big T and small T, and I left the room with the guy who was doing the training and I said, yeah, I think I probably have some small T stuff. And he's like, oh yeah, like what kind of stuff? And I said, well, you know, like getting held hostage and getting shot at. And he was like, I think that's big T stuff. And I was like, oh, like that was just an occupational hazard for me and all my friends when you're like selling drugs and running around in addiction and stuff. So like I rationalized it away, but my nervous system doesn't rationalize it away. And that's like what Lisa's saying is like those symptoms are there regardless.
So that's a few words from Mike Miller. Today's guest with Lisa and I for the Weekend Ramble. We're talking about some of the small T trauma or complex trauma, some of the things that people don't necessarily always associate with trauma and how those things can affect your life. Really great episode, really great conversation. Always love having Mike on. Hey, today's title sponsor is FAR Canada. That's Families for Addiction Recovery. Their services are completely free and they are for the loved ones of people who suffer an addiction. They offer a group meeting 4 times a month for people in similar circumstances to get together and kind of talk things out. They also have a peer support program that's absolutely next level. And of course, if you call during their business hours, you can talk to Sydney, who's one of my favorite human beings if you need some real-time support. You can learn more about them at farcanada.org. And in the meantime, enjoy the show. Hello, everybody, watchers, listeners, supporters of all kinds. Welcome to another episode of the Weekend Ramble on the Ashes to Awesome podcast. I'm your host, Chuck LaFlange, or Chris Horder, whatever you want to call me, checking in Krabi, Thailand. Halfway around the world is my beautiful co-host, Dr. Lisa. How you doing today, Lisa?
I'm good. I'm happy it's Saturday, and I'm happy to be here.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Still enjoying some nice summer weather out there? Looks like it's
like 30,
anyway.
30 something for the next 10 days again or so. We're having a nice hot summer right now.
That's like high 80s in American, I guess, right? So for our American viewers, right?
Yeah.
And of course, our returning guest and good friend, Mike Miller, who's also in my part of the world here in Krabi, Thailand. How you doing today, Mike?
Good. I'm also glad it's Saturday. 30 sounds pretty nice and chill compared to the massive humidity that we're experiencing here, but that's good.
Yeah, right. And it is the humidity that is, yeah. The wet season here, it's actually a few degrees cooler than it was a few months ago, but it is so much, many more degrees more awful in that it's so much more humid. So yeah. But anyway, there's some small talk about the weather. We got that out of the way. And, moving forward.
The important stuff.
Yeah. So for anybody that's not familiar with the platform, and of course, right now we're in the middle of a massive growth spurt, I should say. So I'm assuming that there's new people listening to this. Mike, you head up the Yatra Center, the Yatra Trauma Center here in Krabi. Can you kind of give us the 1 minute on what Yatra Center is, rather than me having to explain it, as I usually do in the promos?
Sure. So we are a residential treatment facility that, 1 minute. Oh, you're putting the pressure on me. You know, I ramble. It exists because I worked in addictions and behavioral health for a very long time. And during the pandemic, I was doing, I got into treating addictions through the lens of trauma before the pandemic. Through the pandemic, people would seek me out specifically for like trauma therapy, EMDR in particular, internal family systems. And I would say to them, it'd be very beneficial if we could do some things to regulate your nervous system, like yoga and all that. And people would say, yeah, it probably would be, but like I'm locked in my flat in London. It's a pretty big ask to get me doing that on my own. And so I thought, as the country's opened up, if I just brought that stuff all to their doorstep in one sort of comprehensive package with the therapy, the psychotherapy, and the body-based stuff, then they would probably get better outcomes. And it's just a lot of the times treating what I call compulsive self-soothing addiction through the lens of treating the underlying trauma instead of just taking the drugs out and leaving people with the pain. We want to treat why they have the pain that they're medicating anyway. So more than a minute, but it's hard to sum it up.
No, it is hard to do in a minute. And again, for people that aren't aware of, our stories or whatever, I came to Thailand to experience your residential treatment program. I myself have some massive benefits that I've seen as a result of, and to say that my life has been positively impacted in a very macro way is not an understatement in any way, shape, or form, right? And I've been very public about that. But where I wanted to go with this episode in particular, and of course, when it comes to trauma and addiction, well, we've done a whole bunch of episodes. We could go on forever and talk about a million things. Specifically, though, the complex trauma, the little t trauma, and I don't even know if it's right to use those two terms in the same sentence and refer to them as the same thing, but that's just kind of how my mind interprets when somebody says complex trauma. I think of the little t trauma stuff, if that makes sense, right? And how that affects us in, and of course we've talked pre-record on the things that we wanted to go over here. So where to start with that?
Well, let me jump in on that for just one sec.
Please do.
Just because to sort of clarify some of that terminology, little t and big T. Yeah. Not everyone uses that sort of terminology, but the understandings that I would have of it would be like big T, like capital T trauma would be like life threat, like threat to your own life and limb or someone around you witnessing that. Whereas the little t would be more like relational trauma stuff. And I think that while you can have relational trauma, so like, being bullied where you're not necessarily at any physical threat.
Hey, just a quick interruption for a PSA. Today's PSA is brought to you by AARC. It's the Alberta Adolescent Recovery Center in Alberta, Canada, where they are doing some crazy things with adolescent treatment. It's just like I keep saying that it's revolutionary, but it's really not. It's been around for 34 years. We just haven't talked about it that much. So check them out, guys, at arc.ab.ca. And here's your PSA.
This right here, this is Narcan, okay? I don't go anywhere anymore without carrying my little case right here. It has 4 doses of the IM Narcan, which is intramuscular, 4 doses of the intranasal kind, okay? This stuff right here can save someone's life, okay? Does not matter if you are currently a user of opioids or a user of illicit drugs in general. It does not matter. If you care about human life,
at any physical threat, right, having a parent who's quite critical on an ongoing basis, things like that. Those can be relational or little t traumas, but they don't necessarily end up with like complex PTSD. PTSD is, and Lisa can correct me if I'm wrong, and this is sort of up her alley as well. It's a diagnosis that you get a lot of the times. It can be from one-off, sort of like big T trauma. Like if someone's in a plane crash, they can have PTSD, or if they're attacked by someone, they can have PTSD. Complex PTSD is going to be like, I was in a relationship that was ongoing with traumas along the way, and it might be relational. There might be like sort of big T events in there as well. But the complex trauma diagnosis is going to be because it took place repeatedly over a longer period of time. And essentially on the nervous system, it's going to have the same effect. But coming out of treating complex trauma, the time frame is much different, because if someone's been in a plane crash, like it's not outside of the realm of possibilities to treat that really, really quickly with things like EMDR, where you can like desensitize that memory in possibly an hour. Like
because it's a memory, not this, extended timeline of events, or
like a lack of safety for months or years at a time.
Okay, Lisa, does that?
Definitely. And so I am not trained in EMDR, which I just noticed now that Mike has a T-shirt on that says EMDR. Didn't notice that before.
I love that shirt. Yeah.
I have a new one coming.
But it's great. But so for EMDR, or the other one that I think there's a lot of similarities or overlap to would be ART, or accelerated resolution therapy. I think similar principles. And a colleague of mine who does a lot of ART work, she's described that you want to sort of have a scene that you're going to work through. So the difficulty is that, if you're in a plane crash and you survive, but you witness a lot of death, the scene's pretty obvious, right? That's the scene that you're going to target with the trauma therapy. The difficulty with the prolonged little t traumas is you're meeting with somebody who, say, for 20 years has been neglected or invalidated or put down or shamed. And so, harder to do, I think, Mike, is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
And trying to come up with that scene.
Yeah, we get it quite a lot with the EMDR too. Like when you set up processing of the memory with EMDR, you always go, okay, well, what's the memory? What single static image, so not like a movie, but like a photograph, what image represents the most disturbing part of that memory? And so a lot of the time it's not an image you could have maybe seen. So maybe Chris and I have some form of like fight or something like that. I might see that from like a third person POV, like from a security camera thing. Like I could not have physically seen it, but that image represents the memory to me. And then you can work on it with that because it does set the scene. You have the image. That's just what it represents. I mean, memory is like highly fallible. So chances are I might be seeing it a bit wrong. But if that's what it is, how I remember it, if that's how I see it, then that's the image we go with. Now, when we have someone who, say, has like an unpredictable, possibly potentially violent parent, I always use the example like alcoholic dad. Sometimes he comes in and he's like happy, and sometimes he comes in and he's like could be like bullying or verging on violent or even violent. Every time his car pulls into the driveway, I'm going to get this like, and then he comes in and he's happy. So I'm like getting in this fight flight response, ready for some sort of event that doesn't happen, but I still have the same effect. Now, if that goes on every day, like that's 365 times in a year, you know what I mean? Like then you ask someone, what's the image? They might say, oh, it's sitting at that window and seeing his car. But if it's not just from the car, if it's from any interaction with them, they might, a lot of times what they say is they go, oh, I just have so many, it's like a felt sense more than like specific memories. Like, oh, on June 8th, 1986, this thing happened. They don't have that. They just go, it's like just this like sense of my dad isn't safe. With the MDR, we can go with the felt sense. But I always try to get the scene or the image where possible, because that's kind of the standard protocol of EMDR.
Of course.
But it's hard.
And I should say right now, right out of the gate, because we only have an hour, we're not going to go into the individual modalities. For anybody that's listening that wants to know more, if you go to the website, 808podcast.com/trauma, there's a bunch of episodes where Mike and has come on with both myself and with Lisa, and we've talked about these individual therapies. So check it out if you want to know more, as we reference things like EMDR or IFS or CBT throughout the rest of the episode. Please do go, and it's actually some of the work I'm most proud of on podcast are those episodes that we put that out, because they're just so informative. So please do go check them out.
And
go ahead, Lisa.
So I think something else is probably important to like talk about as we go into this episode, with this idea of talking a lot about sort of the little T traumas, is the validation piece for people who are listening. Because I think a lot of times what I experience is, again, when you are experiencing little traumas repeatedly, and often your entire life, people normalize it and they sort of minimize the impact that it can have on them. So yes, if somebody has a gun put to their head, if somebody witnesses someone get killed, if somebody almost gets killed, you don't have to convince them that they've experienced trauma. They'll know it. What I actually find interesting is that when people, when I see people, and for me, it's mostly in the day hospital program I'm at where I would deal with this kind of stuff. But when I see them, I feel like I repeatedly have conversations after I've gotten to know them where I'll bring up the fact that I think that there's a huge trauma component to what's going on. And they will look at me and be like, I didn't have trauma. Like, a lot of kids went through that. Really wasn't a big deal. And so but often they've been taught to dismiss it or to sort of put it down. And the point is those things have a huge impact on how you view yourself, how you interact with the world, how you respond to your life as an adult. It's so rooted in these little things. And the point is anything that is constantly sort of beating you down, putting you down, making you feel unsafe, making you have a sense of uncertainty in the world, unpredictability, when it's compounded, it is very profound. And I actually would say even harder sometimes to treat than the big T traumas.
Oh, most certainly. I want to jump on something little and then something a little bigger there, what you were just saying, Lisa. And just as plain curiosity here, have you found that in your work that has shifted since we've recorded all these episodes about trauma? Have you found yourself at work just out of curiosity now, with more of a trauma lens and looking at things that way, or is that just something that comes with being a psychiatrist and being good at your job, right? But
I think so. To be honest, one of the most like altering things for me on here has been some of the IFT stuff that Mike has taught me, to be honest. You know, is there's the part of me and like exploring, well, like let's go down that part of you. I think the trauma stuff, really for me, it's kind of come more from, you know, so when I'm working with a patient in day hospital, it's like a 4-week program. So it's like we start out going through like obvious big diagnostic stuff about like, you know, psychosis and depression and anxiety disorders and that kind of stuff. Then I'll spend a significant amount of time talking about people's childhoods, every single patient I work with. And I'm telling you, it is a gold mine. It's like, you know, we'll go through childhoods, everything from what was your family unit made up of? Tell me about all the people in the family unit. Tell me about your relationships with every individual person in that family unit. Tell me about how your parents engaged or interacted with one another or with your siblings. Tell me about like all of that stuff. And when I am done that, I'm like, I get it. I get it. Because that is where
I could just imagine there's that clinical side of you that would get it, but then there's this empathetic side of Lisa that we all know and love, right? So I could just imagine you're like, oh fuck, I can totally get it, right? I could just see that happening for you, you know, outside of the clinical version of who is Dr. Lisa, right?
But I think I've had like these, it's almost, and not anymore, I don't think it catches me off guard or surprises me, but there was definitely a time when I would start to go, I almost feel like this is trauma. And it surprised me that there were so many trauma symptoms. And when I would dig at the trauma, there was nothing big T, but there was a lot of particularly that unpredictability in their childhood, feeling unsafe in the world, unpredictable parents, a lot of shaming, invalidating. And that was, and I would like dig in the beginning because like, there must be something else. There must be something else. Like you have all these trauma symptoms, and I dig for the trauma and would go, okay, like this is all from this repeated little T stuff. And then but it was amazing to me how prominent their trauma symptoms were. And it was all secondary to repeated little T traumas.
So I'll go back to you, Mike. Now, to make this about me, because that's, you know, the narcissist in me. I'm just kidding, of course. But I have to ask, so my experience with you was when I got to Yatra, I firmly believe right up until probably the first time in therapy with you, that I was there to address this big T trauma stuff that I'd gone through while in active addiction, which was horrific and terrible and all those things. By the time I finished my stay in your program, I had come to find out that so much of my behavior, so many of my relationships were in fact affected by trauma that predates any of that stuff, right? And really, I would say that that's probably where most of the long-term value has come in for me, because I've been able to, you know, I address those core beliefs when mom doesn't call me back for 3 days, or when, you know what I mean, right? Yeah. Those things that used to really trigger me, and I don't even like the word trigger, but it is what it is, right? Yeah. Is that a familiar, like, is that kind of a normal equation to happen for you?
For sure, because it speaks to the myths of trauma, the misunderstandings of it. So a lot of it, you know, kind of speaking to what Lisa said, what her experience, like there must be this big thing back there. Like people think that, and that rationalizing, like, you know, if you look at the one definition of trauma, you know, it's things that happen outside the range of normal human experience, right? So if you're like a first responder, inside your normal human experience is like seeing someone in a car crash. But like if I go see that, like that's outside of my range of normal human experience. It might be traumatic, but it doesn't have to be either, because Dr. Zoe Wyatt, who's like a clinical consultant with Yatra, she did her PhD on trauma and resilience with a lot of people that have been trafficked in Cambodia. And what they found, and all the research about it shows that with resilience, it's about the relationships that you have around you. You're less likely to have a traumatic response. So I always look at trauma as like, it's not what happened, it's what you're left with after, like what's the legacy of that thing. So this speaks to like, well, oh, everyone went through that. I remember the first time I was getting trained in trauma, and I learned about big T and small t, and I left the room with the guy who was doing the training, and I said, yeah, I think I probably have some small t stuff. And he's like, oh yeah, like what kind of stuff? And I said, well, like getting held hostage and getting shot at. And he was like, I think that's big T stuff. And I was like, oh, like that was just an occupational hazard for me and all my friends when you're like selling drugs and running around in addiction and stuff. So like I rationalized it away, but my nervous system doesn't rationalize it away. And that's like what Lisa's saying is like those symptoms are there regardless. A lot of people have this thing where it's like trauma is relative. So it's like, well, this can't be trauma because a worse thing happened to Chris, and the example I always use with people is like, well, like if my hand gets cut off and Chris's shoulder gets cut off, it's not like, oh, this doesn't hurt now just because his shoulder, like his arm got cut off at the shoulder. It's like, no, this still really effing hurts. So there's a lot of stuff in there where it's like people think trauma has to be like, and I use the examples all the time, childhood sexual abuse, plane crash, living in a war zone, that kind of stuff. It doesn't have to be that. Those things definitely can be traumatic, meaning they leave you with a legacy, feeling unsafe, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, sleep disturbances, like, exaggerated startle response, like whatever it might be. There could be all kinds of stuff from that. But that unpredictable father can leave you with those exact same symptoms. I remember saying to people like, yeah, sure, my parents divorced or split up when I was really young, but like 50% of marriages, like big deal. Yeah. It's like, well, it was a big deal because like this speaks to the core belief stuff, right? We form these beliefs about ourselves, other people, and the world. We're not even necessarily aware. Like, it's not this belief I have in my head that I go, oh, the world is unsafe. It's this knowing that I have that's like programmed into me. I know the world is unsafe. How do I know that? Because it was unsafe at this time. I internalize that. And then that becomes the lens that I see the world through. I don't even know it's the lens I see the world through. So, when my parents split up and I come home from school one day and I say, we lived in Vancouver. Then we as a family moved to Vancouver Island. I come home from school one day and I say, oh, where's dad? And my mom goes, oh, he moved back to Vancouver. And by all accounts, so the way I remember it, this could be wrong because, I heard this a long time ago. I think I was like, oh, dad's in Vancouver now. Like, no big deal kind of thing, right? Like, oh, exciting. I have a dad in Vancouver. But like I started to form beliefs about myself that I didn't know I had, which is like people go away. I'm not lovable. I'm not important enough to stick around for. And then I would have like, a girlfriend and we'd get in an argument and I would be like, okay, well, I guess that's over. She doesn't love me. She doesn't want to be with me. Like, or I would have, if the three of us were friends and me and Chris got in an argument, I fully expected Lisa to dump Chris as a friend. And when you didn't, I would be like, what? Like, you're still friends with that guy? Like, I couldn't understand how we didn't just jettison him because that's what happened to me, right? I didn't know that was a belief that I had that was informing all of my relationships. And I was telling you guys in the pre-recording thing, I had formed this belief around that stuff with my dad, which was, and further experiences with my dad growing up, that people are disposable. That was this belief I had. Because it wasn't just I'm disposable. It was like people are disposable. And I had this job as a prep cook, and it was at this restaurant called PJ Burger and Sons in Burnaby when I was like 18 years old. And my job was as a prep cook.
PJ Burger and Sons. I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't exist anymore. But had they treated me right, they'd probably still be around. No, just kidding. So
I recruit the shit out of all my friends. Nobody ever went there again.
Yeah. So my job as a prep cook was to like this particular day, cook up this huge batch of fettuccine. This is really funny too. The guy gets out these baggies and a scale and he goes, can you portion the fettuccine into these baggies on the scale and then put them away? And I kind of laughed. I was like, yeah, I think I can figure that out. I got a little bit of experience with the scale and the baggies.
It's just like, fuck, I got this down and I can tear that scale out. I got this. Yeah.
Comes back.
I got a whole system
like,
for this. Yeah.
This guy's a really quick learner. So So I had
Lisa's
to put
laughing
them
like she's not a muggle.
but she gets it.
I'm a muggle, but I get it.
But anyway, so I had to put the date on the bin of these baggies and put the bin into the walk-in cooler, and I had put the next day's date on it. And my boss came along and said, "Oh, you got the wrong date on that. It's off by a day." I went home that night and I was like, "He's going to fire me. He doesn't want me there." And I literally just never went back to that job. The amount of power that belief had, which is that they're going to get rid of me, was it just like
So you did it
I
first.
Yeah, well, that was the easiest way. And I did that in romantic relationships. I did it with all kinds of stuff. It was like, instead of
And
me saying
easier,
goodbye,
but also, I think easier, but also you took the control in what you thought was going to play out, right? You had the story in your head, and you're like, I'm going to be the one to do this. I'm not going to let you do it to me.
You can't abandon me if I abandon you first. And then I'm not hurt,
Exactly.
even though inside I'm really hurt because I know you're going to do it. But yeah, I did that in all kinds of relationships. Yeah, and it was a measure of control, and it was about like limiting the wound, right? That was bound to be coming, even though it wasn't actually probably coming, right? So it was like, and then it reinforces the belief again, right?
That's probably, I'm guessing, and you know, to people that are listening or watching right now, it's probably one of the most relatable behaviors that you could possibly lay out there. Is that you know, getting rid of it before they get rid of me, kind of thing in relationships as a result of things that have happened. In their
that's
past.
Attachment wound, abandonment stuff, like really common. I think. Like I don't want to say that's the truth for everyone, because you know, but when I see that stuff, that's where my curiosity goes. Is like, oh, so we have abandonment, we have attachment wounds. I'm anxiously attached to people. I'm avoidantly, you know, I'm out of here. You know what I mean? Like you don't get to do that to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's sort of textbook stuff.
Yeah. So, as we're, you know, I've been very open about the things that we've talked about in your office, but
I can either confirm or deny
it. To avoid specifics, though, and like you know, we were talking pre-record, but there's things, and Lisa's mentioned this a few times in other episodes. I don't know if it was with you, Mike, or not, but I have a very clear image of Lisa talking about things that we think at the time are completely irrelevant or unimportant or what'd you call throwaway comments? You said earlier, I think before we were recording, there was a term you used. I really like that. Those throwaway comments, that type of thing that happens when you're a kid, that can turn into a much bigger thing throughout the rest of your life and lead to some of these core beliefs, right? So
absolutely.
You kind of have a generic or, you know, a canned example of that type of thing if you want to lay that out, and we can talk about how that can affect people down the road.
Yeah. And well, I mean, with the throwaway comments, like it could be anything from like I go to my parent and say, I want to be a doctor when I grow up, and they go, "Oh, don't be silly," you know, say I'm a girl. Oh, girls can't be doctors. You know, like, you know, when you're my age, that might have been a belief that was held when I was a kid in the 70s or something. Girls can't be doctors. Then that
I remember telling my parents I wanted to be a hairdresser, and they laughed and laughed, and I didn't know why.
Yeah. So then all of a sudden, like, your dreams get laughed at, right? And then you're going to not have as much confidence in those dreams, perhaps, right? And that stuff can linger on and linger on, and then you might have less confidence in your decision-making ability, and then you might become like a bit of a people pleaser. What do you think I should be? And this is all just like the legacy of a comment that your parents would perceive as being a throwaway that really was not. This is one of the things we come up to. Like, are we just blaming the parents? You know, like Lisa, you talk about the childhood all the time. I talk about the childhood all the time. It's almost like a cliche stuff. But the reason it's cliche is because, you know, like people, like this is where the operating system of a computer gets installed, is when you first fire up that computer. You know what I mean? And with humans, like our operating system is these core beliefs. They get installed when we're quite young. And then that, you know, so it's like, I might form beliefs as I'm older, but a lot of them are installed like pretty young, right? So I think that we're not blaming parents. 95 to 99% of the clients I see, their parents are good people with good intentions, did the absolute best job they could with the tools they had. The problem was they didn't have great tools, and at times they didn't do the best job, but they were still doing the best job. I'm not blaming parents. So we say we're not blaming and shaming. We're just naming what the dynamic was, and we're naming what happened and what came from it. Like, I might have the most loving parent who drops me on my head by accident, and I might, be afraid of people or heights or whatever. Like, there's no intention in that. You know what I mean? Like, I know it's a silly example, but like, this stuff can form the legacies that can follow us. So we always end up talking about parents, but I'm not throwing parents under the bus. This is just the world that we lived in at the time, and the most important people are our primary caregivers, and that's our parents usually. So we're not blaming them.
Absolutely.
But
really, you have no way of knowing. The example. I'll be a little more specific in it. We grew up very, very hand to mouth, right? Mom was a single mom for a while, and then even we didn't have a lot of money, to say the least, right? So we didn't get some of the nice things that other kids got. What I didn't know back then, and I know now, was they were working extremely hard to get the house paid off so they could make a future, all those things. But as a kid, you don't like. There's no way in hell my mom could have known that buying something for herself was going to affect me in this way 40 years down the road. Yeah. Right. And make this turn into a core belief about myself that was going to, there's just no possible way. No. You can't say that she didn't have the tools, or that she just, because it's impossible to think like a fucking 10-year-old. Yeah. Right. Like, because you're not a 10-year-old. Yeah. You're just doing the best you can as an adult and as a parent. Right. Like,
you also need to add in that our parents were also kids once upon a time.
Yes. Right.
And they also had parents.
Monsters, really. Like, at the end of the day, right? If you're going back a couple generations, holy shit, right?
Right.
Spare the rod and all that stuff, right? So
but so like, because I find I do often have conversations with people where there's two parts to it. One is I can sometimes tell that patients are minimizing and protecting their parents when I'm trying to get this information, and we'll have the conversation that we're not, as Mike said, we're not looking to blame or point fingers. That's not the goal. But the reality is that you're born with a temperament. You're not born with a personality, right? And your personality evolves over time. And obviously, you're not generally born with any sort of an active psychotic illness either. So it's like these things come about because of what's modeled for us. So what we see our parents doing, how we see our parents behaving, how we're treated by people in the house, at the school, relationships that we have. So the only way to understand somebody is to have that information. But I feel like I often have to explain that to people. Like, I don't know, you couldn't tell me anything about your parent that's going to make me say, oh, they're a terrible human being, screw them, right? Because even when there is terrible stuff, I will sometimes say, like, imagine what maybe happened to your parent that would bring them to a place where they're doing that to you. And again, the parent's not in the room, so we don't get into it. But I often have those conversations that you got to remember, like, somewhere along the way, your parent thought that, either thought or didn't think, because sometimes it's deeper rooted than active cognitive thinking. But yeah, like, our parents were also kids, and were also raised, and also have all kinds of stuff, and are even less likely to have done any kind of therapeutic work. So,
for sure. And then you could even get into, like, generational trauma and epigenetics and all of that. Like, you could unpack all of that kind of stuff, which we're not going to do here. But this is the thing. It's so complex. It's not simplistic enough to be like, this happened and now it's this. Like, your parent was mean to you and this happened, because that's not the case. I kind of went with, when I was in treatment, vilified my father, alcoholic, terrible, hate my dad, blah, blah, blah. Really, I was just like a wounded kid that, like, wanted my dad to be my dad, but I couldn't say that at the time. I was just like, fuck him, I hate him, pardon my language. And I would have fought anyone to the death that even hinted that my mother wasn't a saint, right? And I couldn't even acknowledge that she didn't do everything perfectly. And the truth of the matter is, like, she's a human being, and she was a single mom, busted her ass to give us everything that we could have. and I didn't have everything, you know what I mean? Like, but she still probably sacrificed tons of stuff to make sure I, as a selfish, entitled little kid, wanted. But there's probably times when she didn't do the best job. Like I remember a glass top coffee table smashing on my foot, and I needed to go to the hospital, and she was upstairs like drinking with her friends. Like, I mean, she's like in her 30s, like hanging out with her friends. Like, of course, like drinking is fine, but she couldn't take me to the hospital. And I would, even to say, oh, maybe that wasn't the most responsible thing. Like, I would never have even been able to acknowledge that, right? Like, there wasn't a babysitter. Every adult in the house was drunk, and I have glass smashed on my foot. Like, it's not predictable, but I couldn't even say like, maybe she could have been the babysitter if she's going to drink with her friends or something. You know what I mean? Probably money got in the way of that. And, as an adult, I can acknowledge that woman did way more than could ever be expected, the best job she ever could, and yet she's not perfect. And I don't feel like that's a traumatic incident, but just it kind of goes the other way of like, I'm not only was I not blaming my parent, but I was blaming one and not blaming the other, and I couldn't see either one of them in a really rational sort of way. They were both like, one was like idealized and the other one was vilified, and neither one of those things were really true.
And also, I think like kids are very concrete in their thinking, right? So when we have experiences as children, we'll develop concrete explanations because children are concrete. They're black and white. And so as a child, dad leaves, dad's bad, mom stays, mom's good, period, right? And then what happens is that thought just kind of gets set that way. And if you don't do therapy, sometimes it surprises me a little bit, but it's like also people like 40 years later who are still stuck in this black and white view on something. And it's the thing of nobody is black and white. We are 10 million shades of gray. And obviously we can sit here as adults and
sorry, that was lowbrow, fucking horrible.
It's bad. I'm embarrassed for you right now.
That's my line
right now.
So blame, not only is blame not fair,
not useful.
90, like you said, 95, 99%, it's not useful at all.
Yeah.
It doesn't serve the person. It wouldn't serve me to say it's mom's fault that I have this core belief, or it's dad's fault this, or absolutely not. If anything, it would do the opposite of serve. It's only going to add to the misery in your life.
Well, it's not going to get into allow you to get into a solution of it if you're shifting the blame. Like, blaming doesn't.
Of course not.
There's no solution in it.
Yeah.
So.
But can I say something about that though, Chris? Because I feel like there's one thing, like I felt like there was a danger in that statement. Whereas, there's no value into blaming somebody. And I'm not saying you were implying this, but just I feel like that's where my thought went. So I believe there would be other people who would have the same thought.
Of course. Yeah.
Is that doesn't mean that it should be dismissed either. Right? The fact that, we can't blame somebody or that it's not all because of something doesn't mean that and we could take any thought and play this game with it. But it can be the most, like as adults, we could look at something in someone's childhood and we could think that seems like the most benign situation or event.
I certainly didn't indicate that, or wasn't trying to indicate that, but I see what you're saying. And a good example, something that we joked about pre-record. I was sitting, I remember my parents sitting at the supper table talking to their friends, and mom said, "Who would ever want to take a bath? You're sitting in your own dirty water." Almost 40 years later, I still can't take a bath. Right? But it's true. So it's kind of a perfect example, right? I'm not blaming mom for that.
Naming that happened.
Naming it and not blaming it. And that's a really simple and great way to say it, Mike. Of course it is, because that's what you do, is right. But naming it, not blaming it.
I just want to say one other thing, if I may, about that is like there are actually people, including parents, that do intentionally harm people, and I don't think like letting them off the hook for that. We're not talking about that stuff. We're talking about like generally parents doing their best, etc.
Exactly.
I just want to be clear. Like some people like need to get the blame. We don't have a part in it. They've wronged us. And a lot of people go, "Oh, forgiveness is the key." I come from the school of like, maybe some things are unforgivable, and it's up to you if you want to forgive them or not. I don't really have an agenda around that stuff. Like, there are those people. So like, we're talking about specific parameters as far as the blaming and not being useful sort of stuff. Cause I'm not telling people,
right. And,
be a doormat to anybody either. Right. So
of course not. Of course not. So now that said, Mike, we'll go back to my experience at Yatra. So we worked through some of the big T stuff with EMDR and wow, right? Like I don't even know how many people I've said it to since, in the 7 months or 8 months it's been since, if you can believe I've been here that long in Thailand. But where so much of this value came in was, now that I've identified a core belief, such as I'm not important, right? Where do we go from there? And how do we, what's your approach? And I know your approach because I was lucky enough to experience it, but if you could, you're having a hard time taking a compliment still. I caught that there. So
part of me hates it. Part of me loves it. Part of me hates it.
I know, right? Yeah. So there we go with the internal family systems therapy part 2, which there's another episode if you go to www.hwapodcast.com/trauma. Anyway, what's your approach on now that we've identified a core belief? How do we move forward from that, and how do we, how do you address that, or as a therapist?
Okay, so I mean, I know we weren't going to talk specifically about modalities, but now we're talking about the actual how do we treat this stuff. The way that we actually identify core beliefs at Yatra is we use cognitive behavioral therapy, a tool that we use, and then we use a technique called drilling down. So say something sort of innocuous happens, like I text Chris and Chris doesn't text me back. My internal dialogue is, he doesn't care about me. And then why do I have that internal dialogue? I drill down and I go, well, if he doesn't care about me, if that's true, what does that mean about me? Well, I mean, it could be a very quick jump from there to like, I'm not important, right? That's where I come up with the core belief by using cognitive behavioral therapy tools. With that core belief, what we then do is we go, okay, well, what memories do you have that support you having that core belief, right? So if I have a thing of I'm not important, it could be like, oh, I waited at school for my parents to pick me up, but they got a flat tire and didn't pick me up. I maybe didn't know that, but they didn't show up, and that day I felt I wasn't important. Or we moved out of our neighborhood to another neighborhood, and I didn't have a choice in where we were moving to. I'm not important, and then we would use EMDR to target those memories to see if we can get some relief from some of that core belief. And part of it is going to be CBT stuff where you just keep disputing that core belief and looking for evidence to the contrary. I actually use a thing sometimes where I get people like not being important, that core belief. I have a file in my head full of evidence that supports why I'm not important, right? And it'll be really ruthless, that dialogue in my head. Well, I'm a loser and I failed at this and I messed this up and I did this and that, blah, blah, blah. And there's this huge file, full, like really robust file of all the reasons why I wouldn't be important. I get people sometimes to build a physical counter file. So it's like, well, Lisa sent you a text that said, hey, I'm just thinking about you and, I hope you're okay. Like, well, clearly that would be evidence that I am important to someone. So I would like print out that text and put it in like a box or a binder or a folder or something. And then any evidence I have that I am important. So when I can't access it mentally, I can access it physically if I'm struggling with that core belief. So it depends on different things. I think what you were speaking to is like go into the CBT and the EMDR, but there's different sort of techniques that people could use. And I think getting, like, we've even done things like letter writing campaigns. Okay, so you give me like 10 or 20 people that were in your life before addiction or before you came to treatment. And we send them a letter that says like, as you know, Chris is in treatment with us. He's had some struggles with addiction, etc. Could you please, if you're willing to, would you be willing to write a letter letting Chris know like what he meant to you before his struggles with addiction, what it was like during his addiction, what it's like kind of now. And then you get these letters that are like the only people that are going to send them are going to be people that are going to be like, there'll be evidence that you're important or that you're loved, or, it'll just dispute some of these core beliefs. And so, I learned that through narrative therapy, like to change the narrative. Right. And that letter writing campaign is really cool. like just disputing it. That's just, I guess it would be a CBT tool too. Like I'm disputing that belief. But yeah, those are some of the things. But EMDR is generally how we do it. So.
Yeah, right. Lisa, what do you got?
Yeah, same. I'm done.
Say
Check
same.
it out. See ya.
You can't say same for fuck's sakes.
No, wait, hold on.
But it is. I mean,
When
yes.
my imposter syndrome loves it when a psychiatrist validates what I just said. I just got to say that out loud.
See, doing therapy on mic at the same time is making my life easy. Same.
There you go. Right? Yeah. That imposter syndrome. That's a funny thing that I've come across so much in the podcast. Of course, myself, right? Like I'm sitting here with two highly educated individuals. I have a grade 9 education. What the fuck am I doing here? You know, what do I? And we've talked about that, and I'm not fishing or whatever, right? But Lisa, you've admitted to it. Mike, you've admitted to everybody. Everybody goes through this, right? And that's a funny thing to me, the whole imposter syndrome, right? I mean, if you've been asked to be on a podcast about any particular subject, in my mind, it's rationally that should dispel any sense of imposter syndrome.
That's not where the core beliefs live, though. My core beliefs don't live in your mind, right? And that's what it is. It's like if I have a core belief of I'm not good enough, then all that rational evidence that shows that someone would value my opinion enough to ask me to come on or whatever, like none of that matters. Like, because I will have other evidence about, oh yeah, but one time with this client, I said this thing and I really stepped in it and it damaged the relationship, or I didn't get the outcome I wanted for the person, or whatever it would be. And so, or it could just be like, this is me. I am a guy covered in tattoos who's a recovering addict. I'm just a junkie. I've been to jail. Like I don't have like a doctorate. I don't, like whatever it is, like I can find different ways to like compare myself down to anybody. And if I go and I get this degree and that degree, there'll always be like the next one I don't have, or there'll always be someone with more degrees or what, like it's just, this is core belief stuff. Right. So, part of it is just, I think it's super common to most people to have that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
no kidding.
I'll expand on my same. But so, I mean, when you ask the question, right, my mind immediately went to CBT, around, because in CBT, we'll look at thoughts or beliefs. We'll look at, we'll tie it together when you're doing true CBT around like how those thoughts and feelings, like how does that feel physically? How does that feel emotionally? And then you look at what's the evidence that this is true and what's the evidence to challenge this thought or this core belief. So my mind sort of immediately went to doing the CBT. And yeah, exactly right. You're looking at, as Mike said, and I've never thought about it that way, but it's true. We always have this huge catalog of evidence to support all of our negative thoughts. My laptop's going to shut off. So you have to then actively explore the evidence that challenges this belief. I tell people, though, that when you have a core belief, right, like, because I'm not working with kids, so I'm working with somebody who's, anywhere from 20 years old to 70 years old. For a lot of people, these beliefs are very, very, very rooted and they're strong, right? So I will tell people, we don't expect this belief is not going to go away in a month of therapy. But the value is, and we talked about this pre-recording too, is naming it, bringing it to someone's awareness. Like I'll have people who it's like, we'll discover a core belief. And then I feel like they spend the next 4 weeks seeing me going, oh, like I do this. And now I realize I do that because I have this belief about myself, But again, you can't change something you're not aware of. And so the fact that they'll be out in the world, not even in therapy session, they'll be out in the world living their life, doing their usual stuff, but suddenly something will happen and they have that, oh, wait, that's because I don't think I'm worthy, or that's because I don't think I'm lovable. And so then they're finding opportunity after opportunity to actively challenge that belief and revisit the evidence that they are worthy, they are lovable. And so it's practice. And I tell people sometimes, especially early on, you do need to put pen to paper or print out the text message or do something really tangible that you can put your hands on, to sort of try to give it strength until you start to believe it. And I also, the other piece I would add in is like broader self-esteem work, right? Because you can work on the core belief of I'm not lovable. But I think even more broadly is just building up your self-esteem beyond trying to convince you that you're lovable. It's just looking for ways that, that people are good. Because the better we feel about ourselves, I think the more empowered we are to challenge negative core beliefs.
Without a doubt.
If I may,
go ahead.
Just really briefly, I agree with all of that. And I think also one thing that we do is not only do we challenge it and sort of dispute the core belief, but then it's like when I'm aware of it, then I can act differently. And it doesn't have as much power to make me do things. And the example that I was talking about pre-recording is that belief I have of like, I'm disposable. And then, because of the abandonment stuff with my dad and everything, and then any relationship I was in, including that work relationship, if there's any sort of like rocking of the boat, I'm like, well, I guess that's over now. When I became aware of that, I had been clean for quite some time. And I was, still operating with this belief, not really knowing that I had it. And I would get into relationships because I was yearning for connection and intimacy and all that. But then when I would get there, if anything happened, I would get out of it. So I had all these like short, sort of like intense relationships. And I wouldn't know how to handle them. And then something would happen and I'd be like, I got to get out of this because they're going to dump me or whatever would happen. When I became aware of that belief, I was dating a girl and we got in, like, we had a disagreement about something, like, it wasn't like some big blowout. We just had a disagreement. And in my head, I went, well, there you go. That's over now. And I went, hold on, wait. That's just that belief telling me that. You don't have to do anything about it. And then the next day I was with her again and everything was fine. Because in healthy relationships, you're allowed to disagree and it doesn't mean that someone's getting abandoned, right? So it really, then I'm doing more esteemable acts by showing up in relationships and not like abandoning myself or someone else. And then that can help to contribute to the building of self-esteem as I act differently once I'm aware of the belief that's fueling all 100%. Of this stuff.
That makes a lot of sense, right? And, we are a recovery podcast, and Mike is something I mentioned to you multiple times. If you get that self-esteem going, it is so good for your recovery. If you can, things like, well, we've discussed that at length. So one of the things, and we'll go back to that, for me, it's the feeling I'm not important thing. One of the biggest thing I've taken away from my experience at Yatra, because I'm offset by 12 hours from pretty much everybody I know and love in the world, right? It is not uncommon for me to take a week to talk to mom or, a few days to really connect with anybody. And I found myself quite often going, hey, wait a minute, that's that core belief again, man. Because it's really easy for me to get wrapped up in, well, fuck, what's come on, why does it but having those tools that I picked up at Yatra has made such a difference in my life that now I can just kind of go on about my day and know that it's just a timing thing. It's, of course, right? And that's been massive for me, right? On top of everything else. So, yeah. Listen, we're getting close to the top of the hour here. We could go on for hours. And as always, Mike, we'll have you back on soon, I'm sure. Right? So
always happy to be here.
Lisa, do you got anything else you want to throw in, or Mike for that matter, just before we move into the final segment, Daily Gratitudes?
We were, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
We were going to talk about, because we've talked about naming, we're not shaming and blaming. One of the things you wanted to talk about was, is it worth having that conversation with your parents? If you realize that,
that
might be where it's emanating from, right?
Please, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, absolutely. So just to to introduce that idea. We had talked about pre-record. Is there anything to be gained by me going back to mom and saying, hey, mom, this is why I have this core value, this thing that was said or done when I was 12 years old? And the answer, I think, to that is not really. But if you want to explain that, Mike, you've got something ready to go, so let's have it.
I same. No, no, but I think that because we're running on the assumption that, if we use mom as an example, mom absolutely did the best job that she had. Whatever she might have inadvertently done that helped install that core belief, because it wasn't any intentional slighting or anything, like whatever happens, because we know that that's just a perception thing, wouldn't have been intentional. So going to her after she's done her best for all this time and say like, oh, mom, when I was 12, this thing happened. This is where I got this core belief, which hasn't served me well through my whole adulthood and everything. How, I would be amazed if a parent didn't get defensive about that. Offended about it, like after all the stuff I've gone through with you and blah blah blah, that would be a normal sort of
especially
reaction.
like our parents, right?
Yeah. Well, that have been through a lot of stuff, right? So I don't I don't think that, what need am I trying to get met by going and having that conversation, right? Am I trying to
validation or something? And
maybe I want to be understood. But the thing is, I always say, you got to go to the right place for the right kind of support and stuff. You don't go to Kentucky Fried Chicken if you want a steak. You got to get yourself to a steakhouse. And if I keep going to Kentucky Fried Chicken and asking for steak and just being pissed off about it, they're going to be confused about why I keep going to the wrong place. And I'm going to be constantly let down. I don't go to my mom to get someone to understand my core belief stuff. I go to someone else who understands core belief stuff. It's not my mom's role to support me through that. And so if I want to be understood, it doesn't have to be by the person. That would be my thing. Because I don't know that they would be in a place where they would be willing to go, oh.
It'd be hard pressed to find a human being that would not be defensive and that not turn into a rather negative experience for everyone involved, right?
And it's not going to get your needs met at that point. So
of course.
I mean, that might vary based on, that's a very generalized thing, but I think, I don't know what the benefit would be. What am I hoping to achieve? Is that achievable? Is that realistic? Am I going to walk away feeling not important once again if I get defensive? Is that just going to reinforce the belief? And is it an unrealistic expectation? So my thought is I can get support around that stuff from my therapist. I can get it from my support group, my peers that kind of understand the struggles of what that's like because they've gone through similar things and we've had those conversations. I wouldn't personally go and talk to my mom about it because I think she would perceive it as blame. She wouldn't perceive it as naming it. She would perceive it as blaming. And I've had that lots of times when we have clients coming to do trauma therapy. I've had a phone call with parents. So well, I'm sure they blame me for everything. And it's well, that's not what we're doing. Right. But that can be the perception. So then if you were to then go to them and be well, this thing, they would probably perceive it that way. That's just my assumption. And I don't know what will get your needs met.
Fair enough. Right. Fair enough. Okay.
I want to know what Lisa says about it.
I think
same.
Yeah, same. I think the question of, and I've had this conversation many times too with patients, and we will often talk about I think people need to sit and explore why, what's driving the desire to go back to the person. I think a lot of times it's they want that validation. They're seeking validation. They're seeking them to say, oh, okay, I did that. They want an apology sometimes. But what I've said to people is unless this person is themselves doing some really intensive therapeutic work, the likelihood, for one, I think it would need to be done in a mediated session would probably be the only way you might successfully pull this off. Having
Agreed.
mom, or we're picking on moms here, but having the person that you feel wronged by at some point in your life together with
perpetrator.
you. Yeah, the perpetrator, right? Having them, having you, and having a therapist in the room, I think would be your best shot at it.
And even that.
I would even go as far as to
really
say
hard.
The perpetrator, I know that we're sort of saying that tongue in cheek, but
perceived perpetrator.
Yeah.
That's why I'm saying it.
Having that person with their therapist you with your therapist.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So
it'd be,
we're
so
all
it's
going to
not
bring our
me and my
lawyers to the
therapist
table
against
for
you.
this. It's,
Yeah. So you know,
Totally.
that isn't often a dynamic that's even possible, because that means two people are in deep therapy, which would then make
just
it
the idea that that's what it would take makes it
Yeah.
well for it to be
something
safe.
that why would you want to do it?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, So
Yeah, I think really the work comes
Horrible.
down to, I think
Internal.
it's you can do your own work and then ultimately not need the validation of anybody, right? Through doing your own work, the goal would be to get to a place where you don't need someone to validate that they did that to you, because you will know and you will proudly own the fact that someone did this to me and it really bloody sucked. I do think one situation where maybe something does need to happen is if it's ongoing. Like if somebody's continuing to treat you that way.
Yeah.
But again, I would
Yes.
say in my experience, if I think
Even
about
then.
certain cases that come to mind, it's less about calling them out and it's more about setting a boundary. It
Yeah.
becomes a
Trying to
thing
get
of
yourself
this
out of it.
continues. Yeah, this continues to be done to me. So I'm going to decide what boundary I need to put in place. So it's again, like we have the authority and the power within ourselves to feel validated, to set and assert boundaries. But I think I think the work can be done. It's not that you have to do it, it's that you can do this and get to the place of peace without needing them to do it for you.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah.
Right. So, all right, my friends. That brings us to my favorite part of the show. That is the daily gratitudes, which are brought to us by, I'm trying to do this during record now rather than having to insert a commercial. And, by Yatra. You're up. I just had to do it.
Yatra? Who's
Daily
Yatra?
gratitudes today are brought to you by the Yatra Trauma Center here in Krabi, Thailand, where I reside. We've talked about who they are. So, Mike, what do you got for some gratitudes today?
Just such a broken record with stuff. But I'm grateful for
for a reason. Right?
Yeah, I'm grateful for my wife really just showing up and doing the stuff that she does. She works with us. She runs a lot of the operational side of the center, and never ceases to amaze me, like how much she can step up in difficult times and stressful times and answer the bell and do all that stuff. And she did that. And then I was also very grateful today that one of my staff members, one of the therapists that works for me, just sent me a nice text to check in and just be like, hey, how are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. And doesn't need to be said, but yesterday was a stressful day. And so just to have someone like check in and just see how I was doing, because a lot of the time I'm the guy that's there for other people based on the role that I'm in. And I'm sure Lisa can relate to that. And I'm sure even in your role in the podcast, you get people coming to you for recovery stuff. Like that's just what happens. So for someone to recognize like, oh, maybe like I might have needed a check-in was like a really, like I said, I'm really touched that you would do that and I appreciate it. And then I went into my like, no, I'm fine though. So,
Can we just make this about you again?
Yeah.
Can we just do that, please?
Yeah.
And
And we're going away tomorrow to stay in this like super cool jungle sort of hideaway thing for a night.
Cool.
Yeah, and
cool.
Videos and pictures to follow. Drones packed, cameras packed, and all that.
I'll bet they are. There's actually a new spot I want to check out with you one of these days, Mike. I was thinking about asking you to meet me there, you and Chu, maybe that new elephant place on down by Aonang.
Sure, whatever.
The restaurant on the corner there. Yeah. You can overlook. You can watch the elephants as you're eating supper.
Oh yeah,
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
I've heard about it a bunch, and just today I drove past it for the first time, so I'm pretty excited for that. But,
as long as it's ethical, we'll show up.
It seems like it is.
Yeah.
It seems like it's an ethical one. Yes. Yeah.
Well, you just gotta be careful. But yeah, if it's ethical, for sure.
Yeah. Lisa, what do you got?
Today I'm going to say that I'm grateful for the team of people that I work with at the hospital.
Okay.
It kind of, it's in my mind right now because I have a patient who's been in the hospital with me for over a year.
Oh, wow.
Who's leaving us this week. And we had some stuff that we were trying to tee up, and actually got a text message from my social worker way after work hours last night, that, he'd gotten an email we were waiting for, trying to get everything teed up for this individual. And it's never lost on me how great the people that I work with are. But they're also above and beyond, right? They're not
Awesome.
there punching the clock. The group of them, the OT, the social worker, they go above and beyond what we are expected to do for people, and they actually care about the individual. And yeah, and so I got that message yesterday evening and felt a lot of gratitude for him, and I'm lucky I work with a group of people like that.
Awesome. Myself, 21 months today, I guess it is.
Beautiful.
As we were recording, I looked at the date and went, oh shit, look at that, we're at 21 months.
Amazing.
So it's actually not till tomorrow technically, but just because of the time difference, right? But it's the 21st here, so that makes it 21 months. And what I've been thinking about actually is of course, because it's come up a bunch in this episode, is my time at Yatra and how much that really helped me, right? And the fact that led to me living what is clearly my best life here in Thailand. And so I'm grateful to you, Mike, for that. Very, very grateful. So I know I've said thank you a few times, but I am very. So there's that. I'm also grateful to every single person who continues to interact with us, be it on the social media, whether you're liking or whether you're watching the podcast, listening to the podcast, talking to your friends about the podcast, whatever you're doing is working. We're going really fast. Every time you do these things, you're getting me a little bit closer to living my best life. My best life is to continue making a humble living, spreading the message. And the message is this. If you're in active addiction right now, today could be the day. Today could be the day that you start a lifelong journey. Reach out to a friend, reach out to a family member, call into detox, pray, go to a meeting, go to church. I don't care. Do whatever it is you got to do to get that journey started, because it is so much better than the alternative. If you have a loved one who's suffering an addiction right now, if you just take one more minute out of your day and text that person, let them know they are loved. Use the words.
You are loved.
That little glimmer of hope just might be the thing that brings them back. Boom.